Okay, so I think we're ready to go. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Polis Project Digital Book Salon. My name is Michael Busch, and I am the Director of Public Programs for the Polis Project. In a different world, our guest today would have been in New York City for a live event, but as it stands, we've been forced to move all of our events online and try to make the best of things moving forward. Before we get started, just a brief note of housekeeping. We are going to try to simulate an actual book event, which means that to the extent possible, we'll try to make this an interactive experience for our audience. If you have a question for our guest, please send it along to the Polis Project Twitter account, which can be found at project_polis, and we will ask it if we have the time permitting. So without further ado, I thought we would get started. I am pleased to introduce our guest this afternoon, Billy Kahora. Billy is an editor, a journalist, and an author whose work has appeared in a wide range of publications, including Kwani's, Chimurenga, Granta, Vanity Fair, and Kwani, where he served as a managing editor. Billy is also the author of a nonfiction novella, The True Story of David Munyaki, and his short fiction has been shortlisted twice for the prestigious Caine Prize in 2012 and 2014, respectively. He is currently a lecturer in creative writing at the University of Bristol and pursuing a PhD in creative writing at the University of Manchester. Billy Kahora, welcome to the Polis Project Book Salon.
Hi, Michael. Can you hear me right?
Can you say that? I think we're having a little bit of a technical difficulty. Can you speak again?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Yeah. You're breaking at some point. I see there's a kind of lag.
Yeah. I think the connection may be a little bit unstable. We'll give it just 2 seconds. Let's see if we can work this out. Okay. Billy, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, fantastic. Welcome to the Polis Project Book Salon, Billy. We're really pleased to
Thanks.
have you. I thought we would just jump right in. I wanted to start by asking about your approach to storytelling in your
Yes.
creative fiction. In addition to sort of your creative writing pursuits, you're also a journalist, and there are moments in the Cape Cod Bicycle War where it seems like you're walking a fine line between fiction and a type of literary nonfiction. And I'm wondering if this is a fair assessment of your work, and if so, you can talk a little bit about how you conceive of those distinctions, their interplay, and how it affects your approach to writing short stories.
Yeah. I think that's a fair assessment with this collection. I mean, one of the things to understand is that this collection consists of stories that I've written. I think I wrote the first story back in 2006, and I think I lost the latest story I wrote in 2017, maybe 2017, 2018. So we're talking about 11 years, uh, where at least half the stories were written between 2006 and maybe 2012, and these were published in various places. And then when I realized I have all these stories that seem to have a common theme, um, I I decided to write 5 other stories based on ideas that had been kind of bugging me for quite a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And over that time, I think my concerns and the kind of way I write and the way I want to write has changed. But it's useful seeing the stories within a spectrum. So um, I started writing because I grew up reading a lot, and I felt growing up when I was a teenager in the 90s that there was kind of this disconnect between reality at the time and what I was reading.
Mm-hmm.
And 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 I just kind of started harboring this feeling, this unease into kind of finding a way to read stuff about the world around me. So I didn't start writing till I didn't actually take any action on that till much later. And things were quite tough in Kenya. So I started thinking about what's the best. When I went to varsity, I found out that I did not want to continue doing what I was doing at the University of Nairobi, and I started thinking about what was the kind of best career path for writing. And at the time, I was advised that journalism. At that time, people thought like if you're going to be a writer, you either did an English degree. At least in Kenya, that's what they thought, or you got a journalism degree. So I ended up in South Africa, and I started doing a bachelor in journalism, and I became quite disillusioned by journalism by the time I'm finishing the degree. I kind of, those were the days people were still talking about the inverted pyramid, the so-called nut graph, as a way of kind of capturing these illusions of objectivity. And in my last year, a lecturer introduced me to literary nonfiction, and I got quite taken in by the new journalism. They were calling it the new journalism based on the work of Tom Wolfe and all those other guys, Joan Didion, all that kind of writing that was going on in late 60s America. And I was also an English major, so I'd also started trying to experiment with fiction. So basically, I'm in South Africa. Kenya is coming off like the tail end of this political regime. I come back to Kenya and I'm thinking, well, I don't want to kind of practice mainstream like journalism, but I think this creative nonfiction stuff can work. But at the same time, I'm quite interested in a kind of social realistic fiction. So I started seeing these two things as different kinds of a similar spectrum. So on one hand, if I really want to capture Kenya's social realities and I want to use fiction, I could use kind of social realistic short fiction. And if I have the facts and there's something that almost, like I think for creative nonfiction to work, at least craft-wise, you have to have like the facts and kind of the events lining up themselves to kind of form a plot or form a story. Mm-hmm. So what I started doing was kind of, because I could make a living writing long-form journalism, that's what I was kind of doing during the day, and then fiction would be what I would try and write. So it just so happened that by the time I was writing short fiction, by the time I was learning how to write short fiction about Kenya and the kind of socio-political conditions, I was also writing long-form kind of journalism or narrative journalism or creative nonfiction about things that were actually happening, which fascinated me. So for the collection, the early stories are that's where you see there's that kind of relationship between those two things. Now, all that said, if I was writing a new collection of short fiction, say, I've been kind of interested in writing about short fiction about being older. What does it mean to kind of live in Kenya and Africa about when you're older? I don't think that would be quite the form, because it's also that thing about writing in one form. One tires of it. It's just the way I think writers are. You just want to try different things. But I think it served me quite well for what I wanted to do at the time. And if you look at the stories, for example, the story called Shiko is quite different. I think I was trying to be more hyper-real there to kind of show the craziness of the time. And some of the earlier stories have more of a kind of descriptive, realistic feel to them. Mm-hmm. So it kind of shows the kind of arc. Yeah.
Absolutely. To sort of illustrate a little bit about what you're talking about, I thought it would be nice if you could read a short passage from one of the stories. And I'm thinking about the story Commission. I think just a brief reading would be
good. Let me look at that. Yeah. The Watua film and the writing people stayed for 5 days. And he only slept at home for that one night. Imagine. When they left, he came back to us. And when we lay together at night, I wanted to ask him many things. But it was not like those years that we had suffered together. For the first time, he asked how things had been when he had been away. And could I say, what? We had just been waiting for him. I did not want to ask him whether he would be going back to Nairobi. A few days later, one of the men who had come before in the minibus arrived at the house. My husband told me that he was a writer, and he also wanted to talk to me. Anataka nini? I asked. He was the one I'd seen giving my husband that envelope. He also said he'd be living with the writer because they needed to work together on the book of his life. This one did not look like a writer. He told Gogo and me that his name was Kahora. Gogo asked him what the name of his people was. He thought for a long time and said, Wanjama. Gogo asked the writer many questions about his people, but we could see that he did not want to talk about them. Gogo says, do not trust anyone who does not talk about his people. The writer's eyes were very watchful, kama chui. Even his face was like a baby, round and brown. We had heard my husband calling the writer Billy. When the writer asked me questions about when we met in Mombasa, I did not remember many things because I had stayed in Olokuto for so long. This Kahora wrote everything down. He also carried a small cassette player and he put our voices in it. I could see my husband was happy to have somebody to listen to him after all these years. Gogo and I sat in the kitchen and we could hear their voices day and night talking politics and the future of the country. My husband said that the writer knew people that would help him start an anti-corruption NGO, and that the book he would write would make my husband famous. He said that the writer was also helping him with getting government to recognize what he had done for the country. He said there were a lot of logistics. Gogo said that all this would make this Kahora famous. But we were also happy to talk to Kahora too. We told him things we had forgotten ourselves. When he asked me about our life in Mombasa, I was happy to have someone listen to me when I remembered my old home. He talked to Gogo about her daughter, my husband's mother, and she told him everything. Kahora put our voices in his small radio. Then he took our voices and left.
Wow, this is one of the more powerful stories, I think, in the collection, and it harkens back to your book, The True Story of David Manyeki. I'm wondering if you could sort of just unpack the context of the story and talk about how it exists in relation to the book.
Yeah. So when I came back from South Africa as a journalism student, I discovered that was when Kwani had been running for a few years. And when I met, so what had happened when I was in South Africa, I'd actually said Binyavanga fiction piece. And I remember meeting up and being very excited about creative nonfiction. And at the time, Kwani, I think, had only produced 2 issues. And when he asked me what I thought about the Kwani, I thought it was great, but I thought it had, I told him I think a lot of the stories didn't have as diverse voices that were needed at the time. I felt there was a kind of almost middle class, almost what I used to describe as better English way of seeing the Kenyan world. And I thought that capturing what had transpired over the last kind of decade or so during Moi would be quite interesting. That was at least in terms of content. But Kenya was also becoming like the Kenyan cosmology at the time, at least the Nairobi cosmology could not be thought of without Shen. And I felt strongly that a world that did not actually capture Shen wasn't really representative of, I think, what was happening in Kenya. So it so turned out, and I was going on quite about creative nonfiction, and it so happened that a friend of Binyavanga's called Judy Kibinge was shooting a documentary on this guy called David Munyake, this guy who had kind of blown the whistle on this big scandal that had happened in the 90s. So Binyavanga told me, well, it seems that why don't you try and write something about Munyake? It sounds like it's right up the alley of this thing you're describing as creative nonfiction. So I met Munyake, and it just turned out to be this incredible story about this guy who'd been in hiding for about 10 years or so, and and somebody who was completely almost unknown up to then by the Kenyan public. So he appeared on TV on this kind of national commissions. And I said, I'll give it a try. So I spent quite a bit of time with the guy. Actually years, could be years, just talking to him. Then I wrote a long piece, and then ultimately I decided to work on a book. Especially when he eventually kind of passed on because he had been through a lot. And and so several things happened to me in the process of writing that book. I was still kind of pretty much pretty green in writing this kind of thing, so it was kind of very emotionally exhausting. The content was quite traumatic in many different ways. But I always felt that, later on, I always felt that there are just so many aspects of all the research I'd done, all the people I'd talked to, that were kind of missing from the book. I mean, the point of the book was really not so much to kind of divulge the mechanics of this scandal, but kind of explore this remarkable individual, and think about what it meant to be a hero. But one of the most remarkable things was meeting his wife. And she, even after I'd finished the book and I was exhausted, I mean, it was so emotionally exhausting that I didn't think I would ever try and do nonfiction once again. His wife's voice remained in my head for a very, very long time. And I just thought that there was something there that I didn't quite capture, right? And because this book was still being written when I was quite new, like, I've always had this kind of regrets. This could have been a bigger book. I could have expanded it. So when I was writing short fiction, because her voice couldn't really disappear, I just really wanted to show her side of the story. So that commission is a kind of experiment about moving from Munyake's kind of masculine voice and telling bits of the story from her voice. But it's also kind of a larger experiment in what I was saying between like this spectrum, I think, in which a kind of social realistic short fiction that I'm interested in and creative nonfiction works. Especially, and short fiction works for this because I don't have to kind of make sure all the facts are correct. Like I could kind of use the imagination. What I just don't really, really want to tamper with, or what I really want to do is really get her voice right. Because I also wrote this story quite recently. There's no way I could have gone back and and interviewed her. Yeah.
Makes sense. Switching gears slightly, but continuing along some similar themes, I wanted to talk a little bit about your story, The Gorilla's Apprentice. And in this story as well, it strikes me that there are elements of fact and fiction at play. And specifically, there's almost a double sense of menace, I think, that penetrates the story. Namely, the 2007 electoral violence in Kenya that sort of hovers throughout the story in the background, as well as the ghosts of the Rwanda genocide, as represented by the character of Samambo. I'm wondering if you could sort of unpack for us how this story came about, and how these two episodes of social violence are linked together with Sebastian the gorilla at the center of the action.
Yeah. The story has so many. I think the story has so many moving parts. So it's very hard for me to quite remember how everything kind of came together. But what's quite important is a kind of context. So here I am kind of working at Kwani. I'm now the editor. The post-election violence is happening, this kind of very big momentous thing. And up to then, I must say, kind of the informal editorial policy had always been to kind of focus on, let me say, aesthetics, like to focus on craft. Like there was this feeling that Kenyan fiction wasn't being published. There were a lot of voices out there. And we kind of, in a way, stayed away from like politics and kind of the social, like thematically. But when the post-election violence happened, we just decided we've got to really take this on. So this is happening. It's a really, really crazy time. It's a time of fear. And then writers just kind of go together. And this workshop was set up by Muthoni Garland, and we were at our house, and we were all these different writers. And the idea was to just kind of write fiction for the next issue of Kwani. And what was remarkable, I actually wrote a lot of this story in a week. And I write these other stories take a long time. Like my stories easily take like 6 months, like on and off. But this story, I think, because of the intensity of the feeling of that period, there's something that just came together where I was just in such an intense period of worrying about like the post-elections. But so, for example, I think early on in the kind of media reaction to the post-election violence, all these kind of weird reports that were going on about how this was a genocide, how people were kind of very loosely, especially foreign media, were kind of loosely comparing this to the Rwandan genocide. So it started, and at the time, a year back, there'd been these kind of rumors about how the previous government had been hiding genocidaires. So there were all these rumors that actually Felician Kabuga was somewhere in the country or had been in the country. And these are kind of the political facts that I guess writers are interested in, these kind of conspiracies. But at the same time, the weird thing about the violence also was that there were many parts of Nairobi that were left untouched. So like the lower income areas and the slums were kind of up, people were actually dying. But what the middle class had done was kind of go and do panic buying, load up at home and have a holiday and watch. So this kind of weird feeling. So it's all these elements kind of coming together in the story. So you have this very intense period in a city that has all these class ramifications. The violence is not happening equally, and yet at the same time, there are all these bigger contextual issues, and just trying to bring them all together. But so it just came to me that using a character like Jimmy and his mother and Kileleshwa and survival, someone. So it'd be interesting to me to have someone who's kind of caught up in between, falling down in terms of class. So the violence is not that far away, but you still kind of have remnants of middle classness. Yeah, like right now, I doubt whether I would actually try a short story with just so many moving parts. I think with time you kind of shrink down. And now that I think about it, there are just so many things, and I'm just glad I think they came together.
Would you do us a reading from The Gorilla's Apprentice?
Yeah. Let me. Then the last question. It is said far in the mountains of Rwanda, men have learned to talk to gorillas. Do you think there is any truth to such claims? Semambo felt the ground shift slightly beneath him. But as hard as he tried, he could not make out the face that had asked the question. The projector light was right in his face, hiccuping because it had reached the end, causing the words on the screen to blink. Seeking new habitat grounds in the face of human encroachment, the mountain gorilla in Rwanda. Is that a trick question? He responded smoothly. The audience responded with light laughter. If I say yes, I might sound unscientific. And you know what donors do with such unscientific conjecture? As the esteemed gentleman sitting before me will attest. In the front row, the museum politicos laughed from deep inside their stomachs. You might have heard of Coco, the famous gorilla who was taught sign language, he went on. It is claimed that he's capable of interspecies communication. I think a lot of it is pretty inconclusive. So the answer would be no. The piercing voice floated again, insistent, the face still invisible. I am asking whether you've heard of men who can talk to gorillas, not gorillas who can talk to men. The audience was now bored. A couple walked out noisily. Then Semambo saw his questioner. He was just a kid, slight and lithe, about 16. Then he remembered. He had seen him a couple of times at the Nairobi orphanage. Was it possible? Then, unbelievingly, the man took a photo of him. The young man took a photo of him. The angry click felt as if it was right next to his ear. The flash lit up the whole audience. And general enforcer of dictums, such as cameras, not allowed in the auditorium. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. I want to allow the young gentleman the courtesy of an answer. There might be something in what he says. I also want to remind you, young man, that cameras are not allowed in the auditorium. There was more uneasy laughter. The herds needed their wine and pastries. Semambo hesitated. But since you all have to leave, I will take the young man's question after the lecture. There was light applause. Baker, the museum coordinator in charge of the Jamhuri Gorilla series of lectures, suddenly emerged from the shadows at the back. A naturalized citizen, he had lived in Kenya since the 1960s as a functionary of one sort or another through 3 regimes. He was useful because he had provided a sort of international legitimacy to the thugs who ran the government. When things swung his way, he could be a power broker of sorts, a middleman between a defaulting government and paternal donors. He slid to the front of the podium. Let me give Professor Charles Semambo, a visiting expert on the African gorilla, attached to the museum for 6 months, a big hand. And please join us for wine in the lobby. After glad handing all the museum officials, Baker came up to Semambo, his face red with embarrassment. Sorry about the camera. Get it, he said tightly. He struggled for a smile, then said very deliberately, please get me that fucking camera. Charles, it's not a big deal. It's not that big a deal. Semambo wiped the sheen of sweat from his face. It was a bad move to bully Baker. Although he remained self-effacing, one could quickly find grants and fellowships drying up. He looked around to make sure no one was within earshot, and with a nod of his head, led Baker to the side of the room, away from the milling bodies. He removed his dark glasses, reaching for a softer, more conciliatory tone. Winslow, you have no idea how big a deal it is. I want that camera. Introduce me to the boy. I will do it myself.
I want to focus on the character of Jimmy for a moment, because he seems to me to be broadly representative of many characters throughout the collection of stories, which I've come to think about as collectively constituting a portrait of youth in modern Kenya, both for the young Kenyans transitioning into adulthood there, but also for those Kenyan expats struggling to live, to build lives abroad. And I'm wondering if this focus on youth was intentional from the start, or if it was a theme that sort of emerged as you wrote these stories and came to understand as binding them all together.
Yeah, no, I just naturally found myself writing youthful characters. And it's simply because when I started writing, what really, really fascinated me was how people survived, or how youth, the people I was observing, kind of survived the 90s. The kind of different ways of actually just making it, this kind of hustle everyone goes through. So the early stories, I kind of just naturally kind of end up working on those. But I think with time, with the later stories, once I realized this was what I was doing, I'd always had, I think for every, say one story that I write, I probably, I have another 3 to 5 ideas that have never really come to fruition. Another one of those ideas is something that I've kind of drafted, but that never takes off. It just doesn't come off. So they started quite naturally, and then with time, I found myself thinking about how many stories do I have, what kind of balance do I need, what is it that I really care about, and I kind of also want to write about, and what's actually just feasible. Because there's a story I wrote, which was based in the UK, which didn't quite make it for different reasons. I think I tried to rush it. Yeah.
And there's also, I think, a counterpoint in these stories, which, against the focus on youth, and that is kind of the absence of parents who, in these stories, are either missing or are in some state of ruin. And I'm wondering if you could sort of focus, or talk a little bit about how this aspect of the stories sort of came about and what their broader significance is for you and what you're hoping the audience gets out of the experience of reading.
Yeah. I think people of my generation have this experience of hearing how golden a time the generation, how golden a place Kenya was in some ways about from their parents. And one slowly gets a sense that this kind of great time has slowly been eroding with time. So I think the 90s, and I've always been curious whether that anybody who's a kind of teenager, whether you're a teenager in the 70s, thought that Kenya was kind of imploding. And it's always my sense that there was this kind of weird combination of a kind of implosion. So you're kind of just juxtaposing all this craziness that's going on. Like the economy is kind of almost crashing because of things like Goldenberg, which I explore in my nonfiction book. But also there are all these stories about like a great past. But also because Kenya is also imploding, it always feels to me as kind of people, when people are trying to kind of make it, there's a certain kind of middle class that was started disappearing in the 90s. And it's the behavior of, in general, of those men and women that I'm kind of interested in. Like, I think while all these young people are kind of trying to make it, their parents, either from my experience, like fall back on the church in the case of women, or the men kind of just disappear, start drinking a lot. And this is the kind of thing I saw in the neighborhoods I grew up in. So that's where that comes from.
Yeah. And at the exact same time, too, there's a very pronounced class element, I think, in these stories. And what's striking is that many of the stories sort of trace and follow these young people who are, sort of not just transitioning through time from youth to adulthood, but are also experiencing transitions of class positions. Some are struggling to sort of move up, and others appear to be struggling to keep the privilege that they previously enjoyed in this kind of like modern era. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see that part of your work functioning.
Yeah, like I think the sense, like my generation, like the sense you get from your parents about this golden generation was that you're told kind of there are these narratives of meritocracy. So basically, the people who are successful are people who stayed in school. If you went to school, if you finished O levels or even went to university, you definitely be successful. Like there's also like when I talk to people who are in the middle class, like these are just narratives that are, I think, constantly ongoing. And I'm very interested in. I feel that when I was a teenager, like there's something about Kenya that changed. That this idea of meritocracy kind of shifted, and this is linked to kind of corruption, networks of all sorts of networks, right? That are kind of happening in Kenya in the 90s. So this shift starts creating different manifestations of how people kind of get ahead. What class means. So class, I think, when you hear it when you're much younger from your parents, is this idea of meritocracy. This kind of traditional idea of the middle class that comes from the West. And then suddenly, because of kind of corrupt networks, all the things that are kind of happening in the 90s, meritocracy disappears. You find people get rich very, very quickly. You find people who don't fit your own idea of being educated become rich quite quickly. So just very, very interested in this kind of distortions of what class meant, right? And what kind of fractures they cause in society. So what happens when the completely disappears? This is something that really, really play around with.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, we're nearing the end of the conversation. We have a little bit of time left, obviously, but we've got a bunch of questions from our audience, and so I wanted to start sort of giving you some of those for discussion. First, the first question we have is sort of interested, it looks like to me, to continuing to push on this question of in your stories, and the way in which they kind of encompass political and social realities of Kenyan life in fictionalized form. And the question is, do the ideas for the stories come first, and then you connect them to real life events, or are the events themselves the inspiration for the stories that you choose to tell?
It depends on the story. The stories come from different places. So some stories come from just pure images, say in my head. and just a very powerful image. Either a very powerful image or something that just comes to my head. Like, I think when you're writing, you just kind of get this sense of something quite powerful that you know will be good for a story, and you know will kind of meet some kind of aesthetic standard you kind of set. And at the same time, something will happen in reality where you think that this would kind of be very interesting as a story. And these are what I would see as a kind of triggers from where the stories kind of come from. So, for example, in some ways, the Gorilla's Apprentice is a combination of all these things, and I just can't think of the genesis of which comes first. But it's one story that's quite different from the others in terms of I have this strong image about this gorilla. Actually, it was a chimpanzee that used to be at the Nairobi orphanage that I used to go visit as a kid, which is a kind of harkening back to some kind of middle class, like a middle classness was when I was a kid, that keeps on disappearing, which is almost non-existent by the 90s for all sorts of different reasons. But there are stories like, say, Selling World Power, which is about this woman who's finds herself in this kind of pyramid kind of scam, which is actually something that happened. This was a kind of newspaper article I spotted in the newspapers about the Chinese. Some Chinese guy had come into the country and had promised people that they would make a lot of money. So it differs with each story. But the point is that all stories you've got to have a real sense of story and the conventions of story. Like, I think you have to really know how stories work. So, for example, the story I mentioned earlier that didn't quite work, I was just too busy. I couldn't see enough images of this story I was trying to write in the UK that kind of fit the story, that fitted the story as a kind of standalone event, as opposed to the kind of larger themes I wanted to explore, which were political exile. So you really, really have to kind of get the images and kind of get the character arc before you even start thinking about how you're going to add and layer all these things that come into the story later. Because stories also work at different levels, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
And at one level, they work at the individual level and the powerful image, but you've also got to think about other things in which the story reverberates.
Terrific. Another question, this one comes from Mohammed in New York. Can you talk about how being an editor of other people's stories has influenced your own creative writing?
Can I?
Sorry, do you want me to read it again?
Yes, please.
Sure. The question is, can you talk about how being an editor of other people's stories has influenced your own creative writing?
Yeah, one of the most interesting things is that I never thought about it till maybe 4 or 5 years ago, because the thing about writing, when I was editor at Kwani, like, the job wasn't completely full-time. So there were these intense periods where we had to produce the journal. And because of the times were so exciting, it was just so fascinating, like reading all the work and being part of that space. And then in kind of low periods of activity, I could probably just go away and kind of write my own fiction. But being an editor works through a different kind of part of your brain, I think. Because first and foremost, you've got to be very passionate about other people's work. And you've got to be able to kind of push away your own, at least for a while. So when you're an editor and you're working on short fiction or you're working on kind of assignments, it works pretty well. But when I started writing a novel in 2013, I started struggling with editing people's work, because a novel is kind of a marathon. At least that's how it would work on a novel. Like, you can't switch on and switch off. It's not like a short story where you'd work on it for like a month or say 2 months and then come back and do this. So immediately I started struggling to kind of be an editor. And the more I got into writing the novel, the more I moved away from editing material. And you can't really be I can't be an editor unless I'm very compassionate about the work. So it's quite a difference. The real influence comes from just understanding the broad breadth of work, which was just so helpful, like that was happening in Kenya. So it gives you such an education. You just have this privilege of reading so much work at a very, very amazing time and kind of getting a sense. And because you're also thinking about the technical aspects of it, it's also quite useful because you think about the technical stuff about the craft of writing quite a bit. So it was quite a privilege, actually, and I learned a lot.
Great. We have another question. This one moves away from your work, particularly, to a concern about the Kenyan literary scene, and specifically allegations against prominent writers. The question says, why you continue to champion serial sexual assaulter Tony Machama after 3 Kenyan women had reported Machama to the police for assault, and why you continue to deify Binyavanga Wenana even after several young African writers have spoken out about his sexually assaulting them.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know. I don't know what championing Tony Moshama would mean, but well, I guess I really haven't seen Tony Moshama for easily 6-7 years. I haven't written or talked about him. In fact, this is probably the first time I've actually ever talked about Tony Moshama in public, which is kind of ironic. But it's also that, I mean, I've been living in the UK for 3 years. I'm kind of out of the loop. I'm not on social media. So I'm just not in touch with him or anything. Or kind of, I don't think I've ever written anything or said anything in public. So I don't know. I'm not sure about championing him. What was the question about Binyavanga?
The question reads, why you continue to deify him, despite the fact that there are allegations of assault against him.
I guess, based in the context of the earlier question, the last kind of public thing I've said about Binyavanga is a obituary I wrote for him. I think that was on LitHub, and that's called, and I can send you a link. And basically, that's been my last public word on Binyavanga. But I must say, I mean, Binyavanga was a colleague for a long, long time. Binyavanga was someone I met when I was a very young writer. He was a big champion of these stories. A lot of these stories never even had come to fruition without him. But because maybe I'm not on social media and because I'm kind of out of the loop, like I've heard about an accusation, but I just don't know in detail what about the accusations. And it could just be that I'm out of the loop, but I don't think there's nothing much I can say apart from maybe go look at those. But I can also send you a link to what I wrote on him, which was when he passed on. But I just haven't deified. I'm quite agnostic actually, so I'm not sure how deify him. But yeah.
Okay. The next question relates actually back to something you said a moment ago. And that is, can you talk about the challenges of writing about Kenya while living and working in the United Kingdom, and the ways in which living abroad has affected your approach to creative fiction writing?
Yeah. So I've been working on a novel for quite a while, about 6 years, and that novel is based in the 90s. So the Kenyan 90s is something that I know of. So I'm quite lucky in the sense that being away hasn't really kind of hurt my sense of that. But if I was to start writing something now, and I'm also thinking, I've also been writing some stuff around the 2008. So I see the thing, my concerns are mainly, when it comes to Kenya, I'm concerned very much about when I was kind of much younger. But if I was to start thinking about writing about Kenya now, I'll probably have to kind of go back and possibly write a draft. So I think that's the kind of content side of things. I think in terms of craft, I don't think I am as enamored of, say, realism as I used to be. I'm quite interested in kind of challenging things, because one thing that things have taught me, these periods that I'm politically interested in, these periods that I'm very interested socially, say the 90s and kind of after the millennium, one thinks when they're living them through that this is quite a big deal. But the things that have even happened, say, since 2008 is a whole other thing that I just hope I can get to. But I'll be better placed to answer that question when I start kind of addressing more of right now contemporary Kenya.
Okay, terrific. Okay, the next question comes from Teru in Zambia. And the question is, how do we make writing more accessible to younger writers?
I think for me specifically, like I really wanted the collection to be published as much as possible first in East Africa, and I'm very interested in the book being as cheap as possible and as going as far as possible. So I can only talk as a writer. I can only talk as a writer in trying to get my books in as many places on the continent as possible, and not forgetting that I kind of feel, is it Sembane Usmane who said that my audience is African and my market is in the West? I don't think my approach is that quite stark, but I'm quite sympathetic to that.
Great. The next question comes from Bhakti in Connecticut, and the question is, can you comment on recent debates about African literature that in some ways are talking to Western audiences? What's the local and the global tension that tends to show up in conversations on African literature?
Yeah, that's quite what's really fascinated me is over the last, say, 5 years or so, like you travel to places or you start talking to institutions who want to talk to you as an African writer, and there's this kind of conversation about, do you live on the continent? I think there's quite a fascinating thing about this demarcation, and it probably comes from, I think, the most visible writers over the last kind of 5 years, especially visible in the larger, I think, publishing space in terms of novels, have actually been living away from the continent. And what's weird is, even though they're located in their own locales, they're always kind of seen as the global writers. It's just such a tough thing to negotiate as a writer, right? For me, I think I'm just really concerned in the kind of Nairobi I kind of grew up, and this is in terms of the content. But I have to be very, very aware of the kind of craft and the kind of technical issues that help one move beyond that very specific content. It's kind of a slate of pen. And it's very hard to kind of describe or talk about till you're writing it. It's just a very, very technical thing. Because ideally what you want to do is play both sides, right? And then there's also the thing to realize that the places that are seen as really global are not that global. They're quite local. So you're an African writer writing in London, but the place is just as small in a way, or the literary space is just as small as, say, the literary space in Nairobi. Like, these places are also kind of small, but because they're considered like the global, they become the trendsetters. And yet they're just all these undiscovered pockets of very serious creativity in places like Africa that I'm afraid never ever enter the global on the scale of that writer in London or in New York. So it's just a very, very kind of tough thing.
Yeah, for sure. Billy, we're just about out of time. I've got one final question for you, and that is from, it's a question from an aspiring storyteller, and that is, what advice do you have for young writers that are just starting out?
Yeah. I think identify or learn how to tap into what you really care about. right? Because I think if you're really, really passionate about something or kind of subjects, like that half, like a lot of the job is done. But also read as much as possible to get a sense of the technical and read the stuff that's important to you and understand the technical ways in which established writers work with what you're interested in. Then all you now have to do, which is never ever simple, is combine those two things. Yeah.
Fantastic. Billy, thank you so much for your time today. It's
Thanks,
really
Michael. I
great
really
to talk to you.
appreciate. Thanks
And
to the
just
Police Project.
yes, thank you. And just for everybody out there, Billy Kahora's The Cape Cod Bicycle War has just been released in the United States from Ohio University Press. Thank you again for your time, and we'll look forward to being in touch again soon.
Take care, man.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye. Bye.